Hello and welcome back to Behind a Better Podcast with me, Post and Victoria. So today is gonna be a bit of a traumatic episode for me, but I feel like I need it in a form of healing for me to relay what went on and the brutality of it. So we're gonna be discussing what went on the 3rd of February this year, 2026. So I'll admit there was only one good speaker I heard on the opposing side for the Nordic model. And we're going to get to their speech because it really hit everybody. Well, everybody who was against the Nordic model. It really hit us. And a lot of my trauma comes from this. Just her speech. Because it was really good in the ways that it did impact people because it was that horrific and it had that many shocking statements. And yeah, so we're gonna go into that. Firstly, we're gonna mention that we did beat the Nordic model. It was a vote from yes 54 and no 64. And I do believe 10 didn't vote. But yeah, it was insane to try and be quiet when they read the vote. I'm going to try and do this in chronological order just for the sake of my autistic brain. But I'm going to start with saying every single person who I met and spoke to, politician-wise, because we did meet some MSPs, the majority ignored us. There was only not even a handful in the meeting actually listened. I would like to give a massive shout out to Ronna Mackay. Fucking amazing woman. Listened to every single bit of information, evidence, facts, real life experiences from sex workers, from people who were trafficked, from people who have had traumatic experiences. And she voted against the Nordic model because she could see what massive impact it would give, and it wouldn't be a beneficial one for sex workers, for trafficked women. It wouldn't be. The facts and evidence is there. Now, in previous episodes, we have talked about how it would be harder for traffic victims to be able to reach out. And when it comes to deportations as well, the UK is not afraid to deport you, even if you are a victim. So, to have a good few politicians, MSPs actually listen to us was amazing. And I will be ever so thankful for that, honestly. Also, a special shout out to Maggie Chapman. Again, she has been there through thick and thin for sex workers. Absolutely amazing person who again understands the evidence and the facts that have been given to them, and the fact that we have given them evidence which deflects what Nordic model now say. Ash Regan, we've come back with these are the facts, these are the evidence, this is why what they're saying is wrong or infactual or exaggerated or just absolutely completely false. And you can look more of that up in my 2 podcast episodes about how the Nordic model now made a leaflet which was just lies. and didn't have any actual studies behind it. But it is a big episode. I think it's 4 hours long that I made for 3 hours, something like that. It took me a while. I would like to just say who voted against the bill. So, as people in Scotland know, the Scottish National Party, they're the ones like in charge right now. They all hold the most majority. I'm not major political savvy, so hopefully I say the right words. So the ones against the Nordic model: George Adam, Karen Adam, Claire Adamson, Alistair Allen, Tom Arthur, Colin Beattie, Keith Brown, Siobhan Brown, we'll come back to her soon, Willie Coffey, Angela Constance, Graham Day, Natalie Donna Innes, Bob Doris, James Dornan, Jackie Dunbar, Jim Farley, Joe Fitzpatrick, Jenny Gilruth, Mary Goujon, Christine Graham, Neil Gray, Emma Harper, Claire Hahey, Jamie Hepburn, Fiona Hayslop, Bill Kidd, Richard Lockhead, Gordon MacDonald, Fulton McGregor, Ron Mackay, Ben McPherson, Gillian Martin, Michael Matheson, Maria McAllen, Irvin McKee, Paul McLennan, Stuart McMillan, Marie McNair, Jenny Minto, Audrey Nicole, Angus Robertson, Shadon Robertson, Emma Roderick, Shirley Ann Somerville, Colette Stevenson, Kevin Stewart, Nicola Sturgeon, John Sweeney, Maria Todd, David Torrance, Hamaz Youssef, Cowcob Stewart, Evelyn Tweed. They are the ones from the Scottish National Party who are against the Nordic model. Kate Forbes did not vote. The Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party, there was 24 for the Nordic model and 1 against. Edward Mountain was against the Nordic model. Alexander Burnett, Annie Wells did not vote. Scottish Labour, there was 17 for the Nordic model, and there was 4 that did not vote. In the Scottish Labour, there was 0 against the Nordic model, which is so shameful. Which speak volumes of why Labour is losing. The people who did not vote was Jackie Bailey, Pam Duncan Glancy, Paul Sweeney, Mercedes Villabla. And of course, the Green Party, the Scottish Green Party, all vote against the Nordic model. The people who did that were Ross Gray, Maggie Chapman, Patrick Harvey, Gillian Mackay, Mark Ruskell, Lorna Slater, Ariane Burgess. Thank you so much for voting against a dangerous bill and for doing the research about why it's a dangerous bill. The independent parties, 5 voted for the Nordic model and 1 did not vote. Colin Smith did not vote. The Scottish Liberal Democrats, they voted 3 against the Nordic model. Alex Cole Hamilton, Liam MacArthur, Willie Rennie. Thank you for voting against the Nordic model. The people who didn't vote in the Scottish Liberal Democrats were Jamie Green, Beatrice Wishart. Of course, we have Reform UK, which voted against the Nordic model. That was 1 person. It was actually very nice to see only 1 Reform person in Parliament, I will admit that. No party affiliation. Alison Johnstone did not vote. It's very disappointing to know that there was 11 people who did not vote. And what I suggest to them is, quite simply, don't become a politician if you intend not to vote. Actually look up what bills will be affecting the people you are serving, because as a politician you are meant to serve the population you are looking over, and see if that bill will do any damage or it will improve people's circumstances. Whereas this Nordic model bill will not improve circumstances for anybody. I would like to say to the people who we did meet up with, we did meet in Parliament, Scotland for Decrim and allies. We did meet a few people, and it's very shameful, the fact that the people who we did meet and we did express that this bill is going to be dangerous, they ignored us. They ignored every bit. And I think what hurt the most is looking Sharon Dowry, Scottish Conservative, in the face, in the eyes, and saying, if you let this bill pass, many women will be in danger and go into poverty, and I will lose faith in politicians. And she thanked us for our stories. And our stories weren't all happy-go-merry. They weren't, yeah, do sex work. No, I talked about getting stealthed. I talked about how the Online Safety Act isn't any good and how we should actually be teaching kids about misogyny, about online safety, about porn, how it is fake, how we should actually be doing better in schools when it comes to sex ed and when it comes to misogyny. And I talked about the trauma which I've had in sex work and outside of sex work. And she still voted for the bill. This woman is not to be trusted. Now, I know what you're going to say. Scottish Conservative, a Tory. They're not going to listen to anybody, are they? And she didn't. She truly didn't. She didn't understand. She wasn't no, we tried to educate her, so I can't, it sucks because I want to say, oh, she wasn't educated enough, but we did educate her that trafficking and consensual sex work were different, and the fact that the government have laws currently for trafficking. Sharon Dowry, failure. Shameful. Not listening to the people who were told they had a voice and then told they didn't, all because it was consensual. Rachel Hamilton, absolutely shameful. Again, she was in the room when we spoke about the harms, and she still voted for the Nordic model. Fulton McGregor, Jamie Hepburn, thank you so much for listening to sex workers, for listening to women misogyny has impacted. Thank you for listening to the allies. Thank you for listening to the facts and evidence. It is extremely appreciative when actual MSPs listen to the people who they claim to protect. So let's get into it. The people who I did meet and completely ignored the facts and evidence, it was just pure betrayal by women who didn't believe women nor hear them. They chose to ignore facts and provable evidence that the Nordic model increases poverty, endangers women, and more, totally bypassing what we, Scotland for Decrim, said about decriminalisation. Decriminalisation is the way. To be heard, but at the same time ignored, is absolutely heartbreaking, and it shows how the government purely is in it for themselves. There was a handful of MSPs we met who understood and actually looked at all the evidence we had gathered. That was wonderful, being heard and actually seeing ourselves be heard in Parliament. However, I hate that every politician agreed that prostitution is violence against women. How? Because men can't control themselves? Women should be in control of their own anatomy. Why aren't we? When we consent to doing what we like with our bodies, why is that not okay? And the absolute hypocrisy was the men interrupting the women in Parliament when the women were speaking. The violence is the men. The violence is the poverty. The violence is not having free childcare. The violence is the rises in taxes. There is a reason people go into sex work, and recent studies have shown a good majority, over 50%, have went into sex work for financial gain to escape poverty. These are all factors of why sex work exists. And what stops women from being able to potentially do things in their life they would like to do? Maybe start a business or go to college or university. They can't. It is not affordable. There was no talk about how men abuse women in the means of, this is what we should do with men. This is how we solve it. Men doing this to women. No. There was multiple talks about how women shouldn't do this, how it's disgusting, how it shouldn't happen. But there was no actual solutions. Apart from, yes, let's ban the men. Let's not teach them to not be misogynistic and teach them to treat women with respect. No. Instead, it was, we're going to punish women for wanting to own their own anatomy. Siobhan Brown sadly thinks that prostitution is violence against women. Siobhan Brown is the Minister for Victims and Community Safety. Prostitution is not violence against women. A woman for sale, consensual, is not violence against women. How we run the economic system and society currently, that is violence against women. We are not doing anything apart from putting a band-aid and going, yes, we're going to ignore this. And we're going to sanction even worse laws and even worse environments for people who are consensually selling sex. Trafficking, that is illegal. That has its own laws. Please go edit them rather than involving yourself in consensual sex work. It is not violence against women. The men can make it violent. But then that is where you have to put your foot down as a sex worker, because it is not for everybody. Because you are working with men who can take advantage of you, and under the Nordic model, they can much more easily take advantage of you because you are afraid of the police, you are afraid of how taboo, how dirty prostitution is seen by other people who have the same views as Ash Regan. They did not respect women in the parliament. I, as a sex worker, did not feel respected at all. Especially the way Michelle Thompson spoke. Now, I would like to say, you can watch this on the Parliament website, absolutely. You just need to type into Google the prostitution Nordic model bill, and it should come up. There was two chairs, two people who were in charge of letting other people speak in the room. They were in favour of the Nordic model, which is why a massive amount of people for the Nordic model were allowed to speak, whereas the people who were against the Nordic model were barely allowed to talk. The amount of childishness that was in Parliament, banging on tables. At one point, one of the MSPs got called a name or something, and they literally wanted an apology. It was like they were 12 years old and they were in charge of the country. It was pathetic. I would have been so embarrassed to be down there with those MSPs acting like children, banging on tables, speaking over each other, laughing, sniggering. It's an absolute joke. Grown-ass adults. The chair was extremely biased because they were for the Nordic model and they barely let anybody speak who was against the Nordic model. The amount of times Ash Regan interrupted people who were against the Nordic model was shocking. There needs to be much more discipline when it comes to people being rude. And that includes the men who are being incredibly rude, interrupting the women. We are literally on about a bill where men are violent against women, and we have men banging on tables, shouting over women. Ridiculous. Sniggering, laughing. There was nothing that would have been put in place for men to stop being misogynistic pigs. To stop misogyny being so rife. Nothing. All they could say was, this is what happens to women who are in prostitution. They didn't believe sex work exists. They didn't believe that there was actual women who liked this job, being a prostitute, being an escort, being a dominatrix. Ash Regan and her friends laughed. To be in the rafters and hearing laughter at the fact that I believe this is a real job and we should all have respect and everybody should have a voice. It was horrible. It wasn't to be humiliated, it was to be discarded. That's what it felt like. That Ash Regan and the people for the Nordic model completely discarded over 100 voices of sex workers and allies and people who have had trauma in the industry and people who have been trafficked. All because we were against the Nordic model. Our opinions, our thoughts, our experiences were then void. They didn't care, they laughed. They laughed at what happened to us. I'd like to replay the speech Michelle Thompson, who was for the Nordic model, said. Now, this speech, accompanied by another person who I think was Ruth Maguire or Kathy Clark. I can't quite remember. I'll need to look back. They were so fucking rude. One of the MSPs, yelled out, "So should we teach this in school? Sex work." And that was a reply to Maggie Chapman's speech. No, but we should teach boys not to be misogynistic. We should teach women that we can be ourselves. We can go astray from traditional roles. We are not going to teach this in school. is absolutely ridiculous, and to make a mockery of a sex worker's job, saying, "Oh, should we teach this in school?" No, but we should be paying our workers the correct wages so we don't end up all in poverty. They were just really, it was just really messed up to see politicians really curve round all the actual problems in the laws and in society that we have in this country. I might get a little bit emotional, but Michelle Thompson, her speech, I quote, "I want to discuss some of the harms for women and I occurred and I record respect for the women in the gallery today." End quote. We're just gonna leave it there for a second. That doesn't include us. That doesn't include the women against the Nordic model. This was only for the people who were for the Nordic model, which I feel like speaks volumes in the fact that they don't have respect. They clearly have said that they only have respect for women who have been harmed in these ways, for the women who are for the Nordic model, not against. Because the people who are against Nordic models, we have a voice, but we are being ignored. And this, what I'm about to say, is very vital. And you need to understand that I've been through some of these things that she's about to speak about. And my voice doesn't matter because I'm against the Nordic model. Quote, "The life they live is to be symptomatically raped vaginally, anally, and orally multiple times a day, to be spat on, to be ejaculated, urinated on, and sometimes defecated on, to suffer repeated abrasions, injuries to their vagina and anus, high risk of being slapped, punched, and 18 times more likely to be murdered, to be strangled, potentially until unconsciousness, with often without even knowing that's happening, to be verbally abused by the people who pay for access to their bodies." End quote. Now we're going to take this piece by piece. So, not everybody sees a client every day. I've literally said before that I literally haven't had a client in 2 weeks. When you do sex work, you need to state your boundaries and you need to put your foot down when it comes to how you're speaking to men and if you need to throw them out at any point. You absolutely could get stabbed, you could get raped, you could get hit. And this is where you need to think about, do I have anything near me for me to defend myself with? You do have to think about this because there are evil men out there who will do stuff. But this bill isn't trying to combat men being violent. It encourages it. There is nowhere that it says you are 18 times more likely to be murdered in doing this job. Nowhere. They are not talking about sex work. They are talking about trafficking. People doing this without consent. This is what I mean by sex workers to them do not exist. Women, people consenting to sex work do not exist to these politicians, to these people who are for the Nordic model. We don't have a voice. They misinterpret what sex work is to fill their own ideas of what they want specifically to try and convince people on. Trafficking is not sex work. Trafficking is not consensual. Trafficking has its own laws, which clearly need to be edited and rewritten. I'm not saying that this doesn't happen, it absolutely does happen. But sex work is when you have consented to doing things, and you can absolutely withdraw that consent at any point. We shouldn't be afraid to be able to tell the police what is happening or what has happened. If the Nordic model comes in, we will be afraid. And that is not okay. Now I'm going to carry on. Quote, to be high risk of contracting STDs and other serious infections. End quote. No. No. This is why we use condoms. In my 9 years of doing sex work, I've not contracted any STDs or STIs. I've not. Which is insane to think about. While pregnant, I had a yeast infection. That was fun. pH balance goes on and off. But no, I wouldn't say I'm high risk at all. When in the 9 years that I've been doing sex work, I have not contracted any STDs, STIs. Is it possible? Absolutely. With any sexual activity, not just when you pay for it. If somebody is a nymphomaniac, somebody who likes sex, somebody who fantasizes about sex, somebody who has sex on their mind constantly, should there be laws for them? Because they might be at quote unquote high risk of contracting STDs by the sounds of what people for the Nordic model see. Or is it just the problem that men are paying for a woman to open her legs? That's the problem. The money. They want women to do this for free. They don't want to see women own their own bodies and be in control of themselves. Quote, to lose most of her earnings to the pimp controlling her, to be mind-numbing substances simply to endure the dislocation, to develop complex PTSD even if she escapes, to struggle for the rest of her life, to struggling to form trusting relationships with men, but on the upside, to learn that her most valuable skill is performing because her rapists require her to act as if she enjoys what's being done to her. Who here would agree that this should be regularized? Who here would agree for the protection of the abusers rather than the women herself? And who here would tell a conscient who can not afford to put food in their mouth that their solution is to put male members in their mouth? End quote. Hearing this up in the rafters, a lot of us walked out. I stayed because I like to torture myself, clearly, and give myself trauma. I do not think my most valuable asset, my skill, is putting a penis in my mouth. I think her saying that really fucking hurt because that is her seeing us as objects and not as people. Because that is not how we see it as sex workers. All this is on about trafficked people. Trafficked people aren't sex workers. Sex workers with consent. And I have PTSD from having a traumatic childhood. I got no help from the government whatsoever. None. And I also had to prove I had PTSD. And the massive wait list to even get seen by the NHS. There are so many big things that branch off of this Nordic model and what they're saying. If somebody has PTSD, complex PTSD, how are you actually going to help them? Like, they didn't give any, it was a shit debate, it honestly was. They were just not saying facts whatsoever, and it was just so bad. Like, they need to go to like Cambridge or Harvard and actually see how a debate actually is. I do have trouble forming relationships, so that's because I'm autistic. And this job is really great for somebody who is neurodivergent. I myself enjoy my job profoundly, profusely enjoy my job. I love putting a smile on my client's face. I love fucking getting paid for it. I am a horny motherfucker. But even when I'm not horny, I have a CNC kink. So, like, I like it either way. Like, there are those bad clients, absolutely. There are those times where I'm like, fucking, why am I doing this? And I close my eyes and I think about somebody else doing it to me. Or just think about the money. But that's what you do in other jobs. You don't really get eaten out in other jobs. But in other jobs, you do have to deal with horrible customers for the money. Hello, capitalism. Not every job is perfect. Mine certainly isn't. And I wouldn't say it's empowering. It has definitely enabled me to be financially sufficient and to leave poverty. Yeah. But we are all under capitalist reign right now, where we do have to pay our bills, we do have to abide by certain laws, we do have to do things a certain way. But for her to say the most valued skill is performing, I don't like that. And that really kind of makes me cry because I don't want to be seen as an object or as somebody who, you know, this is all that I'm good for. And there was nothing positive they said about women. There was nothing. There was nothing they said that could actually help us as sex workers. There was nothing they said that could actually help trafficked women. And then she goes on to say, quote, "We have privileged the reality of prostitution will never be permeate our lives, but it permeates the lives of the poor, dispossessed, the addicted, the trafficked, the homeless, the ones with no voice, exactly the people we are meant to be speaking for." End quote. I'm sorry, what? What about me? What about me? Who loves doing my job? Once again, we are ignored as sex workers because we are for the Nordic model. And I'm not being funny, but we have allies who were addicts, who were trafficked, who were homeless. I mean, for a fucking point, I nearly was homeless. And then I got enough money from doing sex work to be able to afford a place. So the people who she's on about have spoken, but we're getting ignored. That's literally it. That's literally all I just wanted to talk about. It's just how traumatic it was. And just that mainly that speech. But the government needs to do better. And thank you for everybody who emailed their MSPs. Who emailed their MSPs, who understood what was happening. To the one Reform member who clearly had no idea what the fuck he was there for, Graham Simpson, fuck you. Honestly. I don't think any man should be speaking on behalf of, statistically, women. Because, you know, they didn't care about men who were in sex work. No. They only cared about women. They didn't care about trans. They didn't care about non-binary. They cared about the women. Oh, Douglas Ross can suck a dick as well. Because what the fuck? The amount of times he opened his mouth and he just didn't know what sex work was. He didn't understand it. Fergus Ewing can go fuck himself as well. These are the people who did speak in Parliament for the Nordic model. I hate you guys. Carol Mochchen, I feel like she spoke. Yeah, Carol Mochchen. I think that's how to say her name. Yeah, no. Absolutely wrong. Everything that she said. She even mentioned tackling online pimping websites. Excuse me, that is how I pay my bills. Could we not? Could you actually have an education? If you want to create a fucking website, actually, no, I'd rather the government does not create a website for sex workers. Because adult work, they don't give a shit about sex workers, they just care about the money. There's not a lot of sex working websites out there that actually care about the sex workers. Because it is, how to get money and to profit. But no, no. And she even said, we need to look for good examples of how we might be able to change the men behind the computers. No! I need to work. I need to be able to fucking advertise. And she kept talking about give women involved in prostitution a genuine path out of it. I do not want to be out of sex work. I'm very vocal that I don't want to be out of it. I massively want to stay in sex work. Yeah, Alison Johnstone is one of the ones that was for the Nordic model. She was a part of the chair, so she chose who was speaking and who wasn't. So fucked up. Catty Clark voted for the Nordic model. She says one study found that in the United Kingdom, around 2/3 of those involved in prostitution and sex work had been assaulted by clients. Oh yeah, she stated that the Nordic model, there is evidence that the Nordic model has had the effect of reducing the size of the market. No, it hasn't. And reducing human trafficking. No, it hasn't. You literally cannot make any claim about human trafficking when it comes to it reducing because it goes more underground. Than that, in countries where there has been decriminalization, the size of the market has increased. False. We also do not include OnlyFans and things like that, but we also need to consider what happened during COVID, and the economic status of that country. So yeah, she was for the Nordic model, and it was so fucked. Siobhan Brown did say that she would like to speak to sex workers. Ash Regan did not like that whatsoever. She was so furious about that. So it was Ruth McGuire who said, if prostitution is work like any other work, should we be offering it as work experience for young people? Should folk who are job seekers have the benefits taken away from them if they refuse to do so? Oh my god, stop it. You sound like a fucking child. Absolutely ridiculous. No, we should actually be upping wages and taxing less. That's your solution. And it's work like any other work where we get fucking taxed. We get taxed too, even though it's called violence against women and girls. The government still thinks we should give them fuck off. That's not fair. We don't get any protections or anything like that. Like, how dim-witted and small-minded do you have to be to say such a sentence like that? And we really need to not tackle online prostitution because I need to pay my bills. Trafficking, sort it out. Not sex work, not consensual sex work. Only once, I think once or twice, Scotland for Decrim were mentioned. A lot of the politicians did not know what the hell sex work was. Not once did any of the politicians mention that we still wouldn't be able to work together. Otherwise, we will face jail time. Like, if it is truly violence against women and girls, sex work, I would like a tax rebate, please. Annabelle Ewing, I think she was one of the chair as well. But yeah, she was a dick. She was for the Nordic model. It's not fair. It's so biased. One last thing would be when we were all listening to what the results were. Everybody against the Nordic model who was in the stands. We held hands. We were crying. One of us nearly fainted. And there was so much unity. around us, within us. You know what the people for the Nordic model were doing? They had their arms crossed. They were laughing and sniggering whenever they could. It was horrible to know that there were women against owning your own autonomy and going against traditional gender roles of wanting to not be a wife or have kids or not be the breadwinner and to not be a traditional housewife. I will never forget that when the vote said that it didn't pass, we fucking cried. And the people for the Nordic model sulked and groaned and shook their heads and muttered. I cried so much that night, knowing that at least for another year, my job wouldn't be at risk, my livelihood, my child's future. Please get in touch with your MSPs, get in touch with anybody who will listen. Teach them about how dangerous the Nordic model is, how we shouldn't have it here in the UK. Thank you for listening. This has been Behind the Paddle podcast with me, Folsom Victoria. Yeah, this has just been a trauma dump. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode with me mumbling, rambling, slagging politicians off. I was asked recently if I ever get trolled online. Well, any hate. Yeah. Politicians and Women for Scotland have openly harassed me and other members and have even asked if I enjoyed the abuse that women were given when they hired my premises. Because if anybody doesn't know, I used to have a premises where I would let other sex workers use it. And then I was raided by 20 police officers, one with a battering ram, and thrown in the cells for 6 hours and charged with brothel keeping. Because if 2 sex workers work together, then that is classed as a brothel and it's a jailable offence, and it still would be if the Nordic model came into play. I'm seen as an object by them. I'm seen as nothing. I'm too quote unquote privileged to have a voice. But yeah, thank you for listening. Bye. Oh, support Scotland for decrim. Decriminalisation is going to save sex workers and trafficked people. Goodbye.